Hello! I am excited to share a new Stitchalong video with you today. In the Stitchalong series, I'm recording myself stitching key parts of a project and sharing my tips and tricks along the way. If you're a true beginner to needlepoint, you may want to start with videos on how to start and stop a thread and the videos dedicated to each individual stitch, which are all in the Spiders Fun video library, but I'll link out to them below just in case. So let's get started. I've already finished stitching the Zodiac canvas. I haven't turned it into its final object yet, which I think is gonna be an acrylic tray, but I'm really happy with how it looks. I'm loving the different fibers and the different colors. I only use two simple stitches in this canvas, the Continental stitch and the Basketweave stitch. You can see that they look the exact same from the front, but on the back, when you flip it over, they have a different texture and a different weight. The Basketweave stitch is the background stitch. You can see that it's literally woven like a basket, and the Continental stitch is what I used on the letters, and it just has slightly less coverage. But these are great stitches. They're the classic needlepoint stitches, and they're easy enough for beginners to use. Before I start stitching, I want to talk about stitch plans. So when I start any needlepoint project, I try to have a general stitch plan in my head. It's really just, how am I gonna do this? And where am I gonna start? It's a simple but really powerful tool that helps me determine how to best tackle my project. And like I said before, it's just a list of your thread colors, your supplies, and the order of operations that you're going to do. Having this always gives me more confidence to start making changes, breaking the rules on the original design, and then the bandwidth or the ability to add in extra fibers or decorative stitches. It's just a little bit of time to pause and think about what I'm gonna do. And then, as you can see, this is my real stitch plan for this project. As you can see, I'm only making a couple of little changes that are marked up on the sheet. I'm changing a couple of the fibers. Instead of using the prescribed purple, I'm using a metallic glitter yarn, and I'm using a larger, thicker tapestry weight yarn as the background that I had on hand. I thought it would look really beautiful, and I had just enough, which is great. I also am changing the order of operations a little bit. I always start with the details, so I'm always starting with the letters, but since I'm using a decorative yarn, which is a little more fussy, I'm actually going to work this funky word last. Before I fill in the background, but last of the letters. So when you purchase a Zodiac stitch kit, you'll get access to a link that includes a pre-filled stitch plan, as well as a bunch of inspiration for thread swaps you can make and decorative stitches that you can work into your canvas. The idea is that they're matched to your Zodiac sign, so it's a little bit of a fun way to experiment and play around. Now, with that PSA out of the way, I'm going to share the step-by-step process of how I stitched my Zodiac canvas. I hope you enjoy.
I'm going to start by making a waist knot. So we'll thread our needle, fold over the yarn, and then knot two ends together. So you're basically doubling the thickness of your yarn by doing this. You're going to snip off a little bit of extra thread tail, just enough so it doesn't get in your way. And we're going to start by doing the Continental stitch on these letters. I love doing the detail work first and then filling in the background. We're going to start with a waist knot, which leaves the knot tail, that little fluffy bit, on your canvas for just a little bit. And you can see more about making waist knots and starting your yarn in some of my other videos. But essentially what you're doing is the thread tail is running across the back of your canvas and you are cocooning it with stitches. And this specifically is the Continental stitch that we're doing. It's a medium coverage stitch that's great for small detail areas. And it's worked so that the stitch is completely covering both the front and the back of the canvas. I have full tutorials on every single stitch that we're using, but since this is a stitch along, I'm just going to talk through my general process. So what you're going to see is that you work in slightly different directions with the Continental stitch. So I always start moving from left to right. And in this case, you want to stitch, you first put your needle up through the lower left and down through the upper right in terms of the grid hole. So you're going from the lower left, to the upper right. And you can see that motion here. Lower left, crossing that intersection to the upper right. And then when you go back in the other direction, you're going from the upper right in the reverse to the lower left. So in this case, the upper right in reverse to the lower left. Again, I have other tutorials I'll link that have the Continental stitch in slow motion. So if you're a first time stitcher, you can definitely get all of that information. Once you get comfortable with the Continental stitch, I often like to speed it up by doing this technique called needle weaving, which you can see here. My hand isn't moving around from the front to the back of the canvas, and this saves a little bit of time. I'm just weaving it through from the upper left to the lower right and pulling it back through the next stitch that I'll enter. Then I'm going to go ahead and cut off that waist knot, being careful not to chop my thread off, and I'm going to continue. Needle weaving is very controversial. Some people think it doesn't give you perfect thread tension. My thread tension is absolutely never perfect, nor do my stitches ever look perfect, and I have made peace with that. So I prefer to get it done a little faster and a little less exact so that I can move on to my next project. But you should test it out yourself to see if this needle weaving is a technique that you like. Now I'm finishing up. I'm on my last stitch and I need to get across. I'm going to need to get across from one part of the canvas to the other because you can see here, I need to go all the way across. So I have a slight kind of stitch hack that I use to keep the back of my canvas more neat. So what I'm going to do is just pull the needle through existing stitches so you don't even see the pull. And then when I'm weaving the background, when I'm doing basket weave across the background, that thread isn't going to get caught up in my needle. So this is how I move yarn around the canvas, specifically with detail work, and keep things neat on the back. I'm not the most traditional stitcher, so I am just going through every intersection that has this turquoise green on it is getting stitched. In needlepoint, that's how you know what to stitch. What color is the intersection? That's what color your yarn should be. And you're always stitching diagonally from the upper right Now I'm going to end the thread. So I'm just pulling my needle back through the back of the canvas, pulling it through existing stitches and snipping off the thread tail. I'm going to show a new way to do a waist knot. I was keeping it within the same color of letter, but real needle pointers put it in the background and leave that knot until they go back. So that a lot of needle pointers have lots of little knots all over their canvas, And as they work, whatever color is ultimately going to cover cocoon, secure that thread tail, then they'll snip the knot. So a lot of needlepoint canvases are quite messy until you get to the end, and that's okay. It's just a different way to do a waist knot. I prefer to keep stuff looking more clean, so I don't do this as often, but definitely if I'm in a detail area where I only have a stitch or two to do, this is the technique that I use. Here I'm stitching a really, detailed area, and if I ever have a question about where a stitch goes, I am not stitching it, and then I'll go back and add a stitch. You can see that here. I thought it was going to stitch it, and it was not colored green, so I pulled the needle out. If it looks like it needs it at a later time, then I will go back and add it in before I stitch the background. That lets me whip things through a little faster. This is me working around background that's already been stitched. I'm being careful not to split existing stitches or make them look really messy. You can see here I'm fixing the tension on a stitch that looked a little not great. I really shouldn't be needle weaving, to be honest. You really, when you're going in between colors, needle weaving is tough. That's me fixing how a stitch is laying by pulling it out, kind of fluffing it, and pulling the tension again. It's an easy way to fix ugly stitches. So when I do the Continental stitch, I like to work left to right. And I like to go as fast as possible. And I found sometimes that just turning the canvas over 180 degrees when I have to go the opposite direction helps. So I can always be going left to right. I just turn my canvas around 180 degrees. And I'm basically ambidextrous. It allows me to move a lot faster than I would being able to, needle weave one way and having to pick the other way because I'm right-handed. So I think that as you start stitching, you'll find tricks like this that work for you, that are more ergonomic for you. I mean, everyone's hands are different. Everyone's hand strength is different. So don't feel like you have to do your stitches an exact certain way. Do whatever feels right to you, and also what looks good to you. My stitches, wouldn't look great to someone else, but I think they look fine. So it's all about personal preference, and just remember you're learning a new skill and having fun at the end of the day. I always say the needlepoint police are not coming for you, and also they don't exist. So, have a little fun and don't be afraid to try stuff. You can always rip it out. Always. And it's really just as simple as you see the color of the intersection and just pick your way along. Is it green? You're using green thread. Is it light blue? You're using blue thread. And if there's a question, you make a judgment call. I like to play it pretty close and see what's the shortest amount of thread I can have left. This is bad because my tension is like probably going to be a little wonky, but whatever. It's the little excitements when you're stitching needlepoint. The little dramas. Here I'm using a different yarn. It's a thicker yarn, a more tapestry weight yarn. I had this laying around and it matched this background. It's a silk and wool blend, silk and ivory. But since I'm only using one strand, I'm not knotting two strands together. You can see I'm just knotting one strand, and I'll pull just one strand through. This is the color I'm going to use for the background and the yarn I'm going to do my basket weave stitch with. So what you're going to see here is the difference between basket weave and Continental. Basket weave literally looks like a basket. You can see it looks like a woven basket. It's a sturdier, more stable stitch. It's great for backgrounds. It runs in a diagonal, so you'll be stitching in a diagonal versus the Continental when you are stitching in horizontal rows. So you can see where I stopped the stitch, and I'll just keep working from those little two stitches back up, and you go up one way and then back the other. I'm doing the waist knot on the diagonal here because it's the diagonal stitch. And the thing about basket weave, what you want to do is you're pulling up and you're crossing the intersection. So it looks the same from the front as Continental, it's just the back that's different. But you're always working back into that diagonal. So you're coming up through the upper right corner and you're working back into the lower left. You're going back into the diagonal. And if you ever have any questions about if you're going right, just put the needle across and see if the diagonal is true. I like to do the letters and the details first and then do this as kind of a fill-in step. That's what I find the easiest, but you do you. Sometimes I get bored and I'm like, I'll do a little background and I'd like to keep the letters for some extra interest, or maybe I haven't decided what color I want a certain detail area to be, so I'll leave it till the end. But in general, details first, background last. When you get into these little detail-y areas, sometimes it starts getting hard to see that diagonal line. But here you can see I'm working back. I'm just going up to the next row. Going up through the top or the upper right, and then down through the lower left, working back. And I'm not going all the way down the diagonal, I'm filling in, and I am still doing the basket weave stitch. So I'm working back and forth in the diagonal rows, but they're just getting harder and harder to see because it's smaller and smaller rows. But honestly, in the detail areas, you're just getting it done. You could use a Continental stitch in the detail areas. You don't really need to be that true because you really want the stability and the coverage of a basket weave stitch in the bigger chunks of space. Helps prevent distortion from the canvas. And it's just a stronger thread. You're really weaving a textile here with the basket weave stitch. I mean, it's like literally a piece of cloth. It's just diagonal rows, work back and forth, always going back into the stitches you've already done. And I do have more slow motion tutorials on how to do each of these tent stitches, so you can feel free to check them out if you have questions. So basket weave sometimes hurts my hand and it doesn't feel as ergonomic, especially just like Continental when I'm needle weaving, and I can go much faster if I turn the canvas around between each row. And you just have to experiment with when you stitch to see what's the right angle for you. But you can see when I turn it, and I am still working back into the existing diagonal stitches, but I'm just able to go a lot faster when I move the canvas around and the canvas isn't stationary. It's one of the reasons why I actually don't use hoops, because I like to be able to fold my canvas up and manipulate it to make it more comfortable. It means my canvas gets more distorted, but it's more pleasant for me to stitch. And also I can just throw it in a bag and take it wherever, because I like to stitch when I travel or commute. You can see I'm going the opposite direction with this basket weave, but it's not as comfortable in my hand this way, so I have to turn it. And I'll just be able to zoom. I really don't needle weave much when I'm getting into interacting with other stitch colors or fibers, because sometimes you can split stitches or pull up other colors of threads. So in this section, I'm going to be a little more careful, probably. So sometimes you get to a point when you're like, which direction do I go? Do I go back and do these details, or do I continue with the bigger background swaths? I am being very organized with this piece, so I'm going to get the details done. So I'm going to pull my thread all the way across the back, just to that bottom of that E, and start there. And I'm going to start the basket weave stitch anew. And again, you're always going from the upper right down to the lower left. So this thing can happen with basket weave, where if you don't go back and forth across the diagonal, there can be a slight gap in tension. So because you're weaving the stitches into each other, it's important that you go up and back across the diagonal. Clearly, I didn't care when I was stitching this. It's just so slight, and since that's not a big row, it's just a minor area that's even possibly going to experience any issues with tension, I clearly didn't care about it. And I didn't want to take the time to try to figure out which way each row went. And if you want to do that, what I recommend is always leaving a few stitches. Don't finish off a row cleanly. Leave a stitch or two either missing or new in the next row, so you always know which direction you are headed. Otherwise, you're going to have issues. You know what? This silk and ivory, I don't use it that often, but now when I'm rewatching this video and filming the voiceover to go with it, I'm seeing where I tied off this yarn or pulled off this yarn. You can really see the rows when I did it diagonally, but you don't see it in the horizontal. It's really interesting with the yarn, the things you learn as you go. You can't know everything at the beginning. And so here you can see, I feel like I realized it here. So I'm pulling the thread tails down vertically or horizontally. I'm not doing them diagonally anymore because you can kind of see it in the front of the work. Wool is a little more forgiving. So I'm skipping around my video recordings and I'm going to finish up a little bit of basket weave, a little bit of background. You can see there I left 2 stitches. So now I know that row needs to go up. It's something that I was talking about before. It's a cue to yourself when you put a project down and leave it and can't remember which way is which way is up, which way is down, who knows. It's a good little stitcher's trick. I'm going across, I can see a thread tail on the back of this canvas. It's running across the back, and I'm going to be really careful to not pick it up because sometimes, like I mentioned briefly, you can pick up yarn and you can accidentally see it on the front. All the little fibers on these natural threads can almost cause a little halo around around stitches of a different color, and it can get a little muddy. It's really red and white is where you really see it, or black and white, but I always try to be careful if I'm weaving a background around existing colors to not pick up any random fibers. So after I work this little section, I'm gonna go to a color swap that I made on one of the other words. And I typically save any decorative stitches that I'm going to do or specialty fibers until the end. And by the end, I either mean before the background gets worked around them, or in the case of like embroidery stitches, like French knots, I wait until the absolute end. So the background's worked, all other stitches are worked, then I go in on the decorative stuff. And the reason why is you really don't want to overhandle decorative fibers or decorative stitches. So I'm swapping out the color. I'm swapping out a purple wool for this metallic thread tape, and it is pretty finicky. My hands are all over it. Who knows what those stitches are going to look like at the end. But it's a thick thread tape. Well, it's thick width. I'm using 1 strand, and it's beautiful because every stitch kind of looks slightly different and holographic. It's quite funky, if I do say so myself. But I'm carefully pulling it through. This is like the slowest I've ever stitched. I'm just kidding. But I'm being really careful so that it doesn't get pulled too tight and the tension looks good. The stitches look pretty luminous. This was really fun to stitch because truly every stitch was like a different color. And it was really exciting. This is the Continental stitch as well. I'm just working it vertically. correcting the tension. Sometimes with decorative threads, and this is a practice from gold work, which is actually manipulating true metal, you want what is called a laying tool, and really what it is just something sturdy that goes between your canvas and the stitch. In a situation like this, I would maybe just use an extra needle, and you just put it under where you put it right over top of the canvas, and it helps regulate the tension, especially on hard to work fibers. This is fraying really badly. This yarn was really hard to work with because the end frayed. I can't believe I'm needle weaving this. That thread, I pulled it too tight, so now I'm kind of fluffing it up. I'm essentially doing, when I pick that stitch back out, it is essentially doing what a laying tool would do if I was a responsible needle pointer from the beginning, which is just keep all stitches the same tension. But the great thing about needlepoint, it kind of is what you see. What you see is what you get. So if it's looking weird, stop, reassess, try to baby the stitches, fix them, or rip it out. I rarely rip things out. I kind of just go with it. Or sometimes I'll wait until the end, and if I still can see it, then I'll rip out. Because really, by the time you get to the end, you're not as focused on every single stitch. You're really just focused on the end result, which is really nice. I've seen the error of my ways of going too fast. Now I'm slowing back down. I'm doing correct stitching. The decorative stitches, and especially the thread tapes, they do twist really badly, so you have to be mindful of that and always keep the threads flat so that you can get that beautiful lift. I feel like a sports coach watching, what are they? I don't even know what they're called. Replays of my stitching. I'm like, that's way too tight. That one looks good. Technique, it's 10 out of 10. This is a fun example of just how you can swap out colors and fibers and anything you can put through the canvas. You could use as a thread. If you have extra, like if you're a knitter and have extra sock yarn, or a crocheter and you have a small yarn, if you want to kind of spin two yarns together, if you have some pretty gift wrap tape. I mean, honestly, this kind of feels like gift wrap tape, very luxe gift wrap tape, but all the same. You can needlepoint with it, and that's so cool. It's so fun to experiment with fibers and threads and make a canvas truly your own. Look, it's so holographic. Honestly, this yarn is very cool. As an Aquarius, I love it. But I highly recommend you play around and use the canvases and the designs as a starting point and have fun. it's for you or whoever you're gifting it to. This was a different way, and I do this for decorative threads or small areas. Instead of doing a waist knot, I'll pull it through the back of existing stitches and just start from there. And I find, and I'm really careful in those first 3 stitches not to pull it out. You have to really baby it, but sometimes in the small detailed areas, it's the best way to do it. That's my last little tip for you, especially as you're working the small letters or using other decorative stitches or decorative fibers. Sometimes the waist knot is not the best way to go. I'll let you watch this last bit of holographic loveliness and my unpainted fingernails and cuticles. This is what happens when you're messing with yarn all day and fibers all day. Stunning. Honestly, if it weren't so finicky, I would want to be needle pointing whole canvases out of these fibers. They're so fun. Entrancing, really, to stitch. So I hope that you enjoyed this stitch along for the Zodiac Collection. Again, there's all kinds of tutorials that teach you the basics of specific stitches. This was just a peek into how I stitch, how I think about stitching, and my process as I go along. I hope you enjoy and make your canvases your own. I can't wait to see the results, and please let me know in the comments if you have any questions or need any more help or recommendations, or if you have other ideas for how I could have stitched in a better way. I'm always looking for tips from experienced stitchers. It's always really fun to learn new methods and techniques.